Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, and to allow just a little bit more time for everyone to log on, please feel free to type in the chat section where you're joining us from. We'll be getting started in a couple of minutes. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's WWF Insiders virtual event. My name is Grant Gilbert with WWF. In a couple of minutes, I'll introduce Ginette Hemley and Jan Vertefeuille, who will discuss the link between wildlife trade and disease. But first, I want to cover a few housekeeping items to make sure this virtual event runs smoothly. Slide, please. For the entire webinar today, your audio is muted and your video is disabled. We will have time for questions after the presentation. Please type your questions for Ginette and Jan into the chat function, which will be sent directly to the panelists and our team behind the scenes making today's webinar happen. We will be monitoring them throughout the presentation and get to as many as we can. And a final note, we are recording today's webinar so we can share later on our website. Slide, please. Now we'll turn our attention to the link between wildlife trade and disease. The CDC estimates that 75% of new infectious diseases in people are zoonotic. These are diseases that originate with animals and jump the species barrier to people. In this context, the global wildlife trade acts as a superhighway for spreading disease. Many of the animals sold in high-risk markets in Asia and Africa are legal, but the illegal wildlife trade, worth billions of dollars annually, adds to the danger. Ginette and Jan will share what WWF is doing to address this. As Senior Vice President of Wildlife Conservation, Ginette oversees WWF's programs to secure a future in the wild for the world's most endangered and iconic species. She is an ecologist with over 30 years international conservation experience at WWF. As Senior Advisor for Advocacy in Wildlife Conservation, Jan leads efforts to engage the public, change corporate and government policy, and connect our work directly to the people who live on the front lines of conservation. I'll pass it over to Ginette.
Hey, thank you, Grant, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We here at WWF hope that you and your families are staying safe and healthy. We're really pleased to speak with you today about an important aspect of the current COVID-19 crisis, and that is the interface of nature conservation and the current pandemic, particularly the wildlife trade connections, and WWF's work to address the root causes of COVID-19 and help prevent future pandemics. As many of you have probably read in the press and other reports, the World Health Organization has determined that COVID-19 is indeed a zoonotic disease, meaning it originated from an animal and was transmitted to people. Other zoonotic diseases in recent years have included SARS, Ebola, bird flu, and MERS. Next slide. The coronavirus that led to COVID-19 is suspected to have originated in a bat and may have jumped to people via an intermediary species. We don't know. The origin of the outbreak is believed to have been in a so-called wet market in Wuhan, China, that sold live and dead animals, both domestic and wild species, along with other food for human consumption. In February, China took the important step to close their wildlife markets and ban consumption of wildlife for food, which is a critical step to address the problem. But it's just one step that's needed. Many more need to be taken. The issue has shined a spotlight on what we are calling the high-risk wildlife trade and high-risk wildlife markets, particularly in Asia, but also worldwide, which has led to many to call for shutting down these markets and the high-risk wildlife trade associated with them. Next slide. Before we get into the wildlife trade and its connections to zoonoses, I want to touch on some of the key trends in the world of emerging infectious diseases based on information that's been recently compiled by our science team. In the last few decades, we've seen a rise in such diseases with 3 to 4 new ones emerging each year. As Grant mentioned, 3/4 of human diseases come from animals, and most of these are from wild species. Not only do these diseases, of course, cause a lot of trauma, millions of deaths a year, there's a huge economic burden, as we are beginning to see all too clearly with COVID-19. Next slide. So this graph shows the number of new virus species identified each year and the significant spillover events that we've seen in the last 60 years or so. So a spillover event is when a harmful organism, which can be either a virus or bacteria or a parasite, we call these pathogens, is transmitted from a population of one species to a population of another species. And as you can see in the spillover events, the numbers are increasing over the years and have led to some of the deadliest diseases in recent history, including HIV, SARS, Ebola, and now, of course, COVID-19. Next slide. For many zoonotic diseases, bats have been confirmed or suspected as the origin of the pathogen because they are reservoirs for harmful viruses but do not contract the disease themselves. So why is this the case with bats? Well, they have unique characteristics. Their physiology gives them special tolerance to viruses and allows them to carry heavy viral loads without getting sick. And there are more than 1,000 species of bats in the world. And this species richness, which in fact makes bats one of the most diverse groups of mammals in the world, also carries with it a high richness of viruses. And because bats often live in huge colonies and are highly mobile, they can carry viruses to many different kinds of habitats. They are widespread also in urban areas. They do well in areas where people live. And so they often come into close contact with domestic animals and people. But before we are tempted to vilify bats, we need to keep in mind that they are hugely beneficial to nature and the world around us. Bats are important insect eaters, so they help with pest control. They are also important pollinators, and they are important seed distributors for many different plant species. And so they have a vital role to play ecologically. Next slide, please. So there's been a lot of speculation about the precise origin of COVID-19, and this is typical of many zoonotic diseases. It's often hard to know precisely where they come from, but the science is telling us that over the years, the rise of infectious diseases and events associated with them has really been driven by 3 main things. The first thing is how we are using wild animals. So we are trafficking, we are trading, eating, farming wild animals at higher and higher rates. And this has brought people and wildlife into closer contact and has dramatically increased the likelihood of spillover events. We're also producing food differently, and this is really associated with how we are farming animals. In recent years, we've dramatically increased the number of animals we are farming, mainly through factory farms. And while this has certainly increased the efficiency of production, it's also brought new and ideal environments that are really significant for the amplification and emergence of viruses. And when you put factory farms next to wild animals or forests or other habitats, you increase the risk for a spillover event. And finally, a big driver is how we are using land. We are destroying more and more natural habitat and converting it to other uses, particularly agriculture. And this is, again, bringing people, domestic animals, and wildlife into contact in new ways. And again, this is increasing the chances for a spillover event. Next slide. Behind all these factors is one overarching driver, and that is the growing demand for animal protein and wildlife products. And this demand is amplifying and accelerating these other 3 factors, and it's all part of the big system of change that we're witnessing across the planet. Next slide. So how do we tackle these huge challenges? This graphic breaks down the pathway of zoonotic disease transmission into some basic components. These are what we're using to try to shape our strategy for responding. In short, habitat loss and deforestation is making it easier to collect and traffic wildlife and send it to markets around the world. We're going to go into more detail on components 2 and 3 in a minute. But before we do that, next slide, I want to lay out the 5 key elements of the conservation strategy that WWF is working on to help prevent future pandemics. And this is based on taking a holistic approach to nature conservation across the globe. We believe that specific action is needed in 5 key areas. The first is eliminating high-risk wildlife trade, markets, and consumption. Second, we need to implement conservation measures to reduce deforestation and other habitat loss and strengthen land management practices. Third, we need to improve the management of livestock, which is often an intermediary host for zoonotic disease transmission. And we also need to improve food security and address the nutritional needs of the rural poor. And this is especially important where communities rely on wild species for protein. And this is very common across Africa and Asia and Latin America. And finally, we need behavior change at a large scale to reduce consumption of high-risk wildlife and environmental disruption. So these are big components that we need to address, but are very much at the heart of how WWF works and will help us address these trends around pandemics. Next slide. So some are seeing the COVID-19 crisis as the tip of the iceberg, and as devastating as the current crisis is, experts predict that pandemics like this one could occur more frequently unless we stop the destructive behavior and activities that are bringing us into closer contact with thousands of potentially harmful viruses that exist in nature. The top of the list of key actions that need to be taken is shutting down high-risk wildlife trade and markets. And to talk about that, I'm going to turn it over to Jan Vertefeuille, my colleague in our wildlife conservation team. Over to you, Jan.
Thank you, Ginette, and hi, everyone. It's great to spend this time with you talking about this important issue. So Ginette laid out the large-scale strategy we have, and I'm going to talk a bit about the emergency efforts we've taken in the last few months, starting in mid-February when a group of us started designing what those emergency actions needed to be to shut down the kind of wildlife markets where this novel coronavirus originated. Now, this was early in the COVID-19 crisis. It wasn't yet a global pandemic. It was mostly in Asia. But what we knew was that the World Health Organization had determined that COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. It came from animals into people, and it's been traced to a wet market in Wuhan, China. And I want to talk a minute about the term wet market. This is a term that has entered the American lexicon recently. You've probably seen it in press accounts about the COVID-19. So wet markets are sort of the equivalent of farmers markets in the US. These are places with a lot of individual vendor stalls where like mom and pop operations maybe are selling fresh produce and seafood, eggs, meat, like chicken and beef, but also some of these markets have wildlife. And so they're selling both live and freshly slaughtered wildlife in the same place as all this other food. But wet markets in general, not all of them are selling wildlife, not all of them are a conservation concern, and not all are a public health concern. So we want to be careful about the terminology because millions of people around the world get their food every day from wet markets. Next slide. So we have launched an emergency advocacy campaign to close these high-risk wildlife markets and trade in these high-risk species. And of course, the issue of illegal and high-risk wildlife trade is not new. The solutions are known. What is new and different is this moment in time when the entire world and the global economy are bearing the costs of risky wildlife trade. So I feel like we will have squandered an extraordinary chance that probably once in a lifetime to really tackle the issue of this kind of wildlife trade in a way it needs to be addressed if we don't act quickly and aggressively right now. Next slide. So the first thing we did for this advocacy push was to launch a public opinion survey in Asia across 5 markets. We wanted to understand public sentiment around these markets in the places where they're active. We wanted to know if the public supported our push to close markets. So we commissioned a survey of 5,000 people, so 1,000 people in the markets of Hong Kong, Japan, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. This is 1,000 people per market is statistically significant sampling. Next slide. The good news is we found almost universal support across Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, where these markets are the most active, for government action to close them. We also found deep concern among the public about future epidemics if no actions are taken. And then we found that only a small but meaningful percentage of people said that they had patronized these wildlife markets or knew people who did in the last year. Next slide, please. But the survey also found a really strong understanding around the connections between wildlife and public health and COVID-19. So 8 out of 10 respondents said that shutting these markets down would be an effective step to help prevent future outbreaks. Now, this was early March that we did the survey, and I suspect if we redid the survey now, these numbers would be even higher. Next slide. And then 93% of the people in the regions where these markets operate said they would support government action to close them. Less than 1.5% said they would oppose it. So this is an incredibly strong public mandate to these governments that the citizens want them to take action. And again, I bet this number would be even higher now, 2 months later. Next slide. The survey also gave us some really good data about what kinds of wildlife people are buying in these markets. Because for us to design effective consumer engagement strategies to change their purchasing behavior, we need to understand who's buying, what they're buying, and why. And so you see here that there are a number of species being that are quite popular in these markets that have high risk for zoonotic disease transmission, like birds and bats. And then there are also species here that are a high concern for conservation, like pangolins, which are the most highly trafficked mammal on the planet. So this is going to help inform our future campaigns to reach these buyers. Next slide. And what we're learning with this is that this isn't a broad societal norm. It's a small but persistent minority who we need to target. Most people in early March were already saying that they wouldn't buy from one of these markets again. Next slide, please. All right, so what are we doing with this information? We released the survey. It's gotten a lot of attention. We've had more than press coverage all over the world, like 500 stories about this, because it is the first survey to look into this issue of public opinion in the places where these markets exist. But more importantly, we're using it for 2 sets of activities. We're going to use it for policy change and behavior change. So we really need to push the countries that have these markets to really step up their efforts. We need much more meaningful law enforcement. We might need legislation changed. We want to see the various ministries working more closely together. So for instance, the public health ministries really need to be working with law enforcement and environment ministries to do more market inspections in wet markets to make sure there isn't this high-risk wildlife for sale. They really need to be launching public education efforts to their citizenry, and then stopping the international trade at the borders. And then to change behavior, we have plans to scale up both broad public awareness campaigns to really continue to push that this is not socially acceptable and it's actually a very risky behavior to buy this stuff. And then we need very targeted demand reduction campaigns aimed at those diehard buyers, that 10% who seem less concerned that it's illegal or that it's a health risk or it's a conservation risk. So they're going to need some special campaigns to change their purchasing behavior. And we know we need to reach people who both are buying at physical markets, like the one in Wuhan, but also people who are buying online. And we already have a very strong coalition on online trafficking that's working with the biggest social media platforms and selling platforms on the planet. So this again is something where we need to be reaching people through every channel that they potentially could be buying through. Next slide. So, And one thing is, you know, we said we want governments to be working more closely together. Well, we need to as well, the conservation community. And so we have been reaching out to work closely with zoonotic disease experts, One Health experts, public health advocates, and other conservation groups. So last week we launched a joint call to action with steps for decision makers, what they can do to take action around this high-risk wildlife trade. And if you go to preventpandemics.org, you can see the list. We launched this a week ago today, and we have 200 global leaders and experts already signed on to this from 41 countries. The letter is on the website in 6 languages, and we will be sharing this with the World Health Organization and decision makers in Asia, because we want to avoid the issue of decision makers kind of throwing up their hands and saying, well, you know, we got 75 policy recommendations from 75 different groups, so we can't possibly decide what to do, so we'll do nothing. We want to make sure that now there's a clear roadmap that people from various sectors across civil society have said are urgent. So that's what this letter is about. Next slide, please. And then we've made recommendations for US government. And the good news is there's a lot of interest in Congress to tackle this issue. We've already briefed congressional staff. We're working to help shape legislation. We've briefed the State Department, USAID. We're in close contact with Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, we want to make sure that the existing agencies that work on wildlife crime are fully funded and have the resources they need. We also need to see legislation like the End Wildlife Trafficking Act be updated to reflect zoonosis disease risk in the connection to wildlife crime. And then for the State Department to be using high-level diplomatic opportunities to push governments who aren't maybe working as fast as they should in some of these places to take action. Next slide. And the same for global policymakers. This really is, COVID-19 is a global crisis. It needs a global response. And that means we need donor agencies and multilaterals and countries to be helping the countries on the front lines of this. So we've already briefed the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility. We're talking to the Asia Development Bank and others. And really the takeaway to all of this is that we know what needs to be done. We currently have the world's attention, or COVID-19 at least has the world's attention. So we need to act fast to get the changes in place before the painful lessons we're currently living through fade into our collective memory. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Grant because I know we want to have time for questions. So over to you, Grant. I know Grant was having some audio challenges, so I don't know if he's on the line.
Well, thank you, Ginette and Jan. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
I want to thank you for sharing this important work at a critical moment and time for our planet. We're now going to turn to the questions that were submitted in the chat. And as a reminder, if you have questions, please submit them here. We'll take questions and do our best to wrap up about 1/2 the hour. And our first question, how strong is the evidence that COVID-19 originated in a wet market?
Can take that. So the World Health Organization did dispatch a team in February to China and worked with China officials. They determined that that was the first place they could trace it. It was to this wet market in Wuhan. And as you've probably seen, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about maybe it was released from a lab. The best scientific data we have, and there have been several studies of this, is that it was not developed in a lab. It came from an animal. We can't say with certainty which animals, but it does have strong connections to that DNA sequencing, and it likely went through an intermediary species. So that's what we can say about it at this point. I don't know if we'll have a 100% certainty on that.
Okay, thank you, Jan. And our next question here is, has or will WWF be able to leverage this latest outbreak as a moment for increasing funding for international conservation and wildlife trade bans and enforcement?
I'll be happy to take a stab at that one. So I guess one of the encouraging things is, as we've begun to really engage around the strategy that we've just described, is there's a lot of interest in Congress to taking action, both in the form of passing or strengthening legislation to allow the U.S. to do more to shut down markets and risky wildlife trade here in what's coming into the United States, but also giving more authority and opportunity for the U.S. to help other countries. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece is that there is interest in putting more funding into conservation programs associated with enforcing wildlife trade controls and really investigating and trying and helping to identify where the most risky markets are. So there are a lot of discussions underway that we're quite encouraged about, and we think we can build from and leverage even whatever the U.S. government might provide with other forms and sources of support.
Great, thank you, Ginette. Third question, regarding the open letter. What group of people were and are being considered as experts? This is in reference to the website asking folks to come and sign the letter.
That is a great question, and we have gone back and forth with, we don't want to be too rigid on gatekeeping, but we are looking for people who have sort of an expert voice on this. But we're looking for advocates, conservation leaders. We have a number of academics who've signed up, a lot of One Health leaders from around the world who run like One Health university networks and that kind of thing. So I would say that we wouldn't discourage people from signing up. We're not looking, this isn't like a broad public petition, but if somebody considers themselves an expert, to please sign the letter.
Great, thank you. All right, we have another question here. There have been reports of an increase in African poaching because of the economic disruption caused by the pandemic. For example, people desperate for food, less money to fund rangers and other conservation efforts. Can you confirm if this is accurate, and how is WWF responding?
So, I mean, that's a really good question, and one that we're looking into very carefully and trying to assess kind of what we're hearing from the field. There have been anecdotal reports of increases in poaching in parts of Africa, as well as some parts of Asia. One of the challenges, as you might expect, has been that during the lockdown in so many countries, it's been hard to get out to really monitor and see what's going on. We are concerned that illegality, whether it's poaching or illegal trade or other forms of illegal resource use, could pick up because enforcement is not it's not being undertaken in the way that it would be in normal times, but we're trying to learn more and get on top of that. One of the big areas that we're concerned about is the drop in revenue from tourism that often funds national parks and conservation efforts around the world, but particularly in Africa. And we do know that that's an area that that is going to have an impact. Again, going back to some of our conversations, early conversations with Congress, there is interest in providing emergency support to help address those immediate impacts. We don't know how big they will be, but we are concerned, and it is an area that we're trying to stay on top of, and we'll know more, week by week and in the coming months.
Okay, thank you, Ginette. Another question here, asking if we have sought any support specifically from pharmaceutical firms, since it is in their financial interest to get Asian markets to switch from traditional to conventional medicines. Any update on that front?
We haven't engaged directly, to my knowledge, with pharmaceutical firms, at least here in the U.S. We have in the past, in different ways, as we've worked to both with traditional Chinese medicine and traditional Asian medicine experts and with pharmaceutical companies to look at ways to offer alternatives to endangered species that are traded and sold for medicine. The big issue here is not so much medicine, it's the consumption of meat, exotic meat, and so that's kind of a different type of trade. There are some overlaps, but that's the big focus right now is the consumption of wildlife, mainly for meat, through different market mechanisms in Asia.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. There was another question here about food and meat versus medicinal purposes. So We have another question about other NGOs with whom we're partnering. Could you speak to some of our other partners in this effort?
Sure, I can talk about sort of the emergency sort of advocacy push that we're doing. We are, in constant conversation with all of the usual kind of conservation partners out there. I think everybody, this wasn't in anyone's work plan for this year to go ahead and, launch a COVID-19 campaign. So everybody is working as fast as they can to sort of shift time and effort to this, understanding what a crisis it is. So we are, regularly talking to Wild Aid. We are talking to WCS and Freeland, and a lot of the groups on the ground in Asia as well have already started to come together. There's a couple kind of loose coalitions forming to push for policy, change together. And then on the behavior change and demand reduction, there are only a handful of groups that go deep on this, including WWF, and we're already coordinating with them, like how do we divide and conquer what is a very massive consumer group that we need to tackle. So I would say that we're in regular contact, and Ginette may know some of the others that we're speaking to in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, we work with most of the other groups who focus on international conservation very closely, both here in Washington with our efforts with Congress, for example, and we're certainly comparing notes and sharing information on efforts that are either very much the same or very complementary to address this immediate issue of risky wildlife trade and risky markets.
Great, thank you. And we have another question here about wet markets in comparison to people who live with livestock or wild animals. Are wet markets much more risky in terms of disease transmission?
So there's a number of ways zoonotic disease transmission can be spread, and Ginette probably want to take this one, but I can talk about the wet markets. That one of the reasons that the wildlife markets within wet markets, or some of them are, separate, just wildlife only markets in some places. The reason they are so risky is that you have very unsanitary conditions. Often it's illegal trade. You'll have bats in cages piled on top of pangolins, on top of rodents, on top of dogs. And stressed animals, just like us, their immune system is working overtime and they're shedding like viruses. And all of the bodily fluids and the virus shedding are intermingling. So it's just like a giant petri dish of, it's a perfect storm for creating a new dangerous zoonotic disease, because it's just unsanitary and it's got everything crowded and warehoused into these cages. So that was what makes the wildlife markets within wet markets particularly dangerous, but there are certainly other disease transmission vectors like livestock, as we've seen, with avian flu and things like that. So I don't know if Ginette, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just a couple points. I mean, just as Jan said, I mean, I think the most immediate priority is dealing with these large, mixed, poorly regulated wet markets or wildlife markets in Asia. And when you're mixing so many species, both domestic and wild, you really just increase the chances of viral transmission. On the source side, in Africa in particular, it is a very different situation. There are some similarities, but you've got also high-risk markets at the local level. There are many across Africa, thousands, and that is a challenge. How do you start to address that? We're again sort of looking at it through prioritizing by size of market in areas that have been associated with disease transmissions in the past, which may be higher risk areas, but we need to go a lot more deeply into those more community-based efforts, as well as associated with livestock practices. Again, much is often very localized. So there's a lot of work to do there. Some good work has been done by a number of public health organizations, and we need to build from that to really now look at the high-risk wildlife piece of it as one of our big components of our strategy.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for one final question here. This is about the reception of U.S. and international governments to our policy proposals. These are early days for reactions in terms of COVID. But there's a question about how receptive the international community has been, and does this represent a real opening in terms of movement?
You want to take that, Ginette, as head of policy?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of talk right now. You know, a lot of governments, you know, are saying, and you know, like us, action is needed. Obviously, China took a very critical step, and we hope that the ban becomes permanent. We believe that a legislative change will allow for that, and that's is a priority for the Chinese government. We understand that the Vietnam government likewise has committed to legislation to shut down high-risk wildlife markets, but we haven't seen enough action more broadly yet. You know, I think by working with not only the conservation organizations and community, but you know, what we're trying to do differently is really connect with the public health sector on this, because it obviously is first and foremost a public health problem, and that is our strategy. There is a unique opportunity with our own Congress around a bill that is around the whole idea of One Health, which is a cross-sectoral approach to addressing these issues. It's getting a lot of attention. We hope that that can be a model that, if it's successfully passed here, could also be a model for other countries. But we're going to need to keep at it, and as Jan said in her presentation, we can't lose this moment, right? This is critical, and we're going to see more of these kinds of pandemics, and probably more frequently, and probably more serious even, unless we really shift strategies and look at this problem much more holistically.
Okay, thank you, Ginette and Jan. That's going to do it for our webinar today. Thanks for sharing your insights in this critical time. I also want to thank everybody for joining us. We're going to be following up by email with links for further reading, and we're also going to include a survey about your experience on today's webinar. And finally, please mark your calendars for the next installment of the WWF Insiders Virtual Event Series. Our next episode will be on May 21st, featuring Anita Van Breda, WWF's Senior Director of Environment and Disaster Management, and it will feature our response to environmental emergencies such as the recent fires in the Amazon and Australia. Thanks to everybody for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.